The year was 1941, and the world was standing on the precipice of a catastrophic shift. While Europe was already engulfed in war, the Pacific was brewing with tension. Japan had set its eyes on a larger, more sinister goal: domination of Asia. But no one could have predicted that a small, isolated island in the middle of the Pacific would become the flashpoint that would draw the United States into the most destructive conflict the world had ever seen. Pearl Harbor, the name itself, is etched in history, forever tied to an attack that would send shockwaves through the world. But what led to that fateful day on December 7, 1941? What events, what choices, and what ideologies led Japan to launch a surprise attack on American soil, dragging the United States into the Second World War? The story begins far earlier than most people realize, in a tangled web of ambition, desperation, and geopolitical maneuvering that would change the course of history forever. It all started with the rise of Japan as a militarized empire. By the 1930s, Japan had already begun its expansionist policies. The country, an island nation with limited natural resources, had long sought to break free from the restrictions imposed by the Western powers. Its population was rapidly growing, and its economy was under pressure, with limited access to the resources it needed to fuel its industrial engine. So Japan turned its gaze to China, a vast land of untapped resources and strategic importance. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, a region in northeastern China rich in coal and iron, both critical for Japan's industrial growth. The invasion was swift and brutal, and the League of Nations condemned the attack, but Japan, undeterred, withdrew from the international body. The message was clear: Japan would no longer abide by the old rules of the Western-dominated international order. As Japan's aggression continued, the United States found itself increasingly at odds with its rising power. America had its own interests in Asia, particularly in China, and the notion of a Japan-dominated East Asia was unacceptable. But it wasn't just about geopolitics. There was an ideological component as well. The United States, a democratic republic, viewed Japan's increasingly militaristic government with suspicion. The Western world, still reeling from the horrors of World War I, was desperate for peace. But Japan, under its military-led government, had different aspirations. Japan's imperialist dreams weren't just about economics. They were driven by a desire for power, status, and security in a rapidly changing world. By 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China, marking the beginning of what would become known as the Second Sino-Japanese War. The conflict was brutal, with atrocities like the infamous Nanjing Massacre, where thousands of Chinese civilians and prisoners of war were murdered. The United States, horrified by the reports of Japanese aggression and human rights violations, responded by taking action. In 1939, President Franklin D. Roosevelt imposed an embargo on Japan, cutting off access to vital materials like oil, steel, and scrap metal. This embargo hit Japan hard, particularly its oil supply, which was essential for its military and industrial activities. Japan's need for resources was becoming more desperate, and the United States, once a friendly trading partner, was now seen as a major obstacle to Japan's ambitions. But Japan wasn't the type of power to back down from a challenge. Instead, they began looking for alternatives to secure the resources they needed. And where better to look than Southeast Asia, a region rich in oil, rubber, and other vital resources. In 1940, Japan moved to occupy French Indochina, further expanding its empire. This move was seen as a direct challenge to the interests of the United States, Britain, and the Netherlands, all of whom had significant holdings in the region. The United States responded by tightening its embargo, freezing Japanese assets in American banks and cutting off oil shipments entirely. This was the moment when the tension between Japan and the United States reached its boiling point. Japan's leaders realized that their empire could not survive without oil, and without access to the Southeast Asian oil fields, they would be forced to scale back their expansionist ambitions, or worse, face economic collapse. In Tokyo, the decision was made. Japan needed to act, and it needed to act fast. But the United States was not an easy adversary. The Pacific Fleet, stationed at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, was the primary military deterrent in the region. Japan's military leaders knew that they could not continue their conquests if the United States stood in their way, and the only way to guarantee their success was to neutralize America's military power in the Pacific. This would require a bold, preemptive strike. In early 1941, Japan began planning what would become one of the most daring and infamous military operations in history. The plan was simple: destroy the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, buy time to solidify their position in Asia, and hope that the United States would not have the will or the resources to fight back. The Japanese High Command, led by Admiral Yamamoto, knew that attacking Pearl Harbor would provoke a powerful response. But they also understood that the longer they waited, the stronger the United States would become. It was a gamble, a desperate bid to secure Japan's future in a world that seemed to be closing in on them. Yamamoto, a brilliant strategist, famously said, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." He was right, but at the time, he believed Japan had no choice. As the months passed, the plans for the attack were refined. In the fall of 1941, a Japanese fleet, consisting of 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, and a fleet of smaller ships, set sail toward Hawaii. The attack would be launched on the morning of December 7, 1941, and it would come as a complete surprise to the Americans. The United States had intelligence suggesting that Japan might be planning something in the Pacific, but no one could have predicted that it would come in the form of a sudden, devastating strike on one of the most important military bases in the world. On the morning of December 7, 1941, the sun was just rising over the Pacific as Japanese bombers and fighter planes descended upon Pearl Harbor. The attack was swift and overwhelming. Within hours, the American fleet was crippled. 8 battleships were damaged, 4 of them sunk. Nearly 200 aircraft were destroyed, and over 3,500 Americans were killed or wounded. The attack left the United States in shock, and the country that had prided itself on its neutrality was now thrust into the heart of the Second World War. The response from the United States was immediate. On December 8, 1941, just one day after the attack, President Roosevelt addressed Congress, calling December 7, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. Congress declared war on Japan, and just days later, Germany and Italy, Japan's allies in the Axis powers, declared war on the United States. The world was now fully embroiled in the deadliest conflict humanity had ever known. But how did it come to this? How did tensions between 2 powerful nations, separated by vast oceans, escalate to the point where war seemed inevitable? The roots of the attack on Pearl Harbor were not just about oil or territory. They were about ideology, fear, and the clash of 2 worlds that could not coexist. Japan, a rising imperial power, believed that its destiny was to dominate Asia, while the United States, a democracy built on the ideals of freedom and self-determination, saw itself as the guardian of a new world order. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not just an act of war. It was the culmination of years of diplomatic breakdowns, economic pressure, and the failure to understand the other side's true intentions. Looking back, it's easy to see Pearl Harbor as a singular event, a catastrophic surprise that changed the course of history. But in reality, it was the result of years of complex political, economic, and military decisions that led 2 nations down a path of inevitable conflict. Japan's decision to attack Pearl Harbor was not just a military maneuver. It was a reflection of the deeper forces shaping the world in the early 20th century, forces that would reshape the world forever. The attack was a defining moment, not only for the United States, but for the entire world, setting the stage for a global conflict that would last another 4 years and change the face of geopolitics forever. Pearl Harbor was not the beginning of World War II, but it was the moment that brought the United States fully into the war. And that moment would echo throughout history. As the United States entered the war, the initial shock of the Pearl Harbor attack turned into a fierce determination. The American public, initially divided about involvement in the conflict, united in anger and resolve. Roosevelt's call for war, backed by the nation's leaders, was met with overwhelming support. The phrase, "Remember Pearl Harbor," became a rallying cry for soldiers and civilians alike, motivating the American war effort in ways that no prior action had managed. The United States quickly shifted from a defensive posture to a full mobilization of its military and industrial resources. Factories that once produced civilian goods now churned out planes, tanks, and ammunition. The country's vast industrial capacity, largely untouched by the war, became a critical factor in the Allies' eventual victory. This industrial machine would be key in the struggle against Japan, Germany, and Italy, turning the tide in both the European and Pacific theaters. In the Pacific, the United States faced an opponent who had just delivered a devastating blow. But despite the initial success of the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan was already beginning to face the reality of their gamble. While they had crippled the American fleet in Hawaii, they had not destroyed the United States' ability to wage war. Crucially, the American aircraft carriers, the heart of the Pacific Fleet, were not in the harbor on December 7. This would prove to be a decisive factor in the ensuing naval battles. The Battle of Midway, just 6 months later, would be a turning point in the war, with the United States dealing a crushing blow to Japan's naval capabilities. Japan's initial advantage in the Pacific, built on a strategy of overwhelming surprise and territorial conquest, was slowly eroded by the United States' resilience and innovative military strategies. The war in the Pacific would be characterized by brutal island-hopping campaigns, with each battle intensifying the resolve of both sides. Yet, as much as the United States struggled to secure victories, Japan's continued expansion proved to be unsustainable. The Allies, particularly the United States, leveraged their growing technological advantages and superior resources to push Japan back, reclaiming territory island by island. In Europe, the United States had already begun to focus on defeating Nazi Germany, which had declared war on the United States shortly after Japan's attack. The American military would soon find itself engaged on two fronts. But just as in the Pacific, American resolve would be critical. The D-Day invasion in 1944, the culmination of months of planning and coordination, would be a decisive moment in the European theater. The United States, alongside its allies, would begin the liberation of Western Europe, and the Axis powers would find themselves facing overwhelming opposition from all sides. In the broader scope of the war, the attack on Pearl Harbor was not just a catalyst for American involvement, but a key moment that reshaped the global order. After 4 long years of intense and devastating conflict, the Axis powers were defeated and a new world began to emerge. The United States, having fought on 2 fronts and emerged victorious, was now poised to become the dominant global superpower in the post-war world. Meanwhile, Japan, after suffering devastating losses, would be forced to reckon with its imperial ambitions and the reality of its defeat. The repercussions of the attack on Pearl Harbor would echo for decades. The post-war period saw the United States take on a leading role in the creation of international institutions, such as the United Nations, designed to prevent future global conflicts. The economic and political landscape of the world had been fundamentally altered. Japan, once an aggressive imperial power, would undergo a dramatic transformation, shedding its militaristic past and embracing a pacifist constitution imposed by the Allied powers. In the end, the attack on Pearl Harbor was more than just a military engagement. It was a flashpoint that signaled the end of one era and the beginning of another. It was the spark that ignited the American war effort and the entry of the United States onto the world stage as a global power. The echoes of Pearl Harbor would be felt in every major decision made during the Cold War, as the United States and the Soviet Union navigated the world order in the shadow of the lessons learned from World War II. In the years that followed, the names of those lost in the attack, along with the heroes who rose to defend the United States, became part of the collective American memory. Pearl Harbor was not just a date in history. It was a moment that reshaped the future, forever altering the course of the 20th century. It was a reminder of the fragility of peace, the power of resolve, and the lengths to which nations would go to protect their ideals. And as the world rebuilt after the devastation of war, the memory of Pearl Harbor remained a testament to the cost of conflict and the strength required to emerge from it victorious.